Greetings, old friends. Today, let's take a look at two new offerings from the Royal Armouries Collection by Easton and Windlass. These have been developed over the course of 2 years and has gone through several iterations of prototyping. And what you see here are the final versions of these at release. In the past months, they have instantly become hot commodities. And I am lucky enough to get my hands on two models. One 15th century English longsword of Oakeshott Type XVII blade. The other one, the so-called Wakefield English Hangers, a type of late medieval falchion. Can they live up to their premise as one-to-one replicas of the originals housed at Royal Armouries? Let's find out. Now, the historicity of these two swords have been introduced by Easton, the YouTuber, antique dealer, and HEMA instructor. So I wouldn't reiterate them as usual. Let's just take a look, focusing on the build quality and the authenticity of these two replicas. Keep in mind that these are priced between $600 and $800 at lunch, sort of a upper mid-range. So when we evaluate these, we have to put them into context of the price they charge. I have to say that as one-to-one replicas, the first thing these two that impress upon me is the deviation they have from the originals. One very obvious deviation is the weight of the sword. The weight of this Type 17 longsword is a hair above 3 pounds, and the original house at Royal Armouries in Leeds weighs 3 pounds and 6 ounces. And it's missing is organic grip made of wood and leather. Also, if you account for some minor material loss along the blade, there's probably 200 grams of material missing on this one. The Wakefield hanger weighs 748 grams. That's actually closer, half an ounce lighter than the original. But the original is also missing the grip, which is pretty short, and it has some material loss on the upper portion, resulting in some perforations. So I would say probably the original weighs above 800 grams. Still, that's about less than 2 ounce difference between the replica and the original. Now we'll switch to voiceover for audio quality purposes. Easton went to the museum to choose 6 iconic swords in medieval English history, and in his words, studied them meticulously by measuring each component of the sword carefully and handling them to better understand the context of their usage. Now, each model has gone through several iterations of prototyping, and he kept pushing them to correct errors in the implementation and stick closer to the original. Now, given Easton's credential as a seasoned HEMA instructor and event organizer, an archaeologist by training, and an antique dealer, people have no doubt that the blueprint and the advice he gave to Windlass wouldn't have resulted in the most close replications, especially when you consider that Easton has taken the prototypes to the museum for the curators to compare closely to the original pieces in order to certify these models and put their name on the packaging to sell at their gift shop. But the bottleneck here is not the product designer or the licensing museum, it's Windlass, the maker. Since the announcement of the Royal Armouries Collection, numerous seasoned collectors have expressed their doubts about Windlass' capacity to fulfill these designs in a reliable manner, based on their track records of making inexpensive swords that are known to cut corners, not just in the fit and finish and the quality of materials used, but in the critical aspects like mass distribution to handle like the swords their products claim to replicate. Now, having handled both swords, I can assure you that this is light years ahead of Windlass' usual qualities in every and each way. So the prices that double or triple their usual offerings is more than justified. They are much better swords across the board. The question here, however, is whether they live up to the premise of being one-to-one replicas. I measured the sword and found the blade slightly shorter, and narrower at the base, while being 10 to 15% thinner across the blade. The transition of the cross sections are represented. However, I'm not sure how accurate it is, as the final result is 13% lighter than the original. The ricasso is implemented correctly with a hollow ground geometry, introducing more mass to the base, making the forte of the blade a little bit more durable for parrying, and adding some steel to the base of the blade to help with the mass distribution for better handling. Past the ricasso, the blade transitions into a hexagonal cross-section with a full flat ground bevel, terminating to a 1/4 inch thick edge. The distal taper is also evident. The base of the blade is 7.2 millimeters thick, while the original and the official specification states 8 millimeters. Near the tip, the thickness is 4.1 millimeters on mine, while the original is 5.2. This probably explains why it is so much lighter. While I am not upset about getting a lighter sword that's just half an ounce over 3 pounds and having a point of balance of 4.4 inches from the guard, it's not really true to the original sword that is trying to replicate. The very exaggerated convex distal taper also makes me question the accuracy of mass distribution. Throughout the 16 centimeter long ricasso, the thickness remains 7.2 millimeters, and it starts tapering down very slowly down to 6.3 millimeters at the midpoint of the blade, which happens to be the termination of the hexagonal cross-section. Then it transitions to a diamond cross-section with a prominent central ridge. The thickness flares up a bit, then tapers down linearly to 4.1 millimeters at 2 inches from the tip. The entire blade is thick, as a Type 17 longsword are generally viewed as armor fighting longswords, with thick and narrow tips to jab into the gap of plate armor and penetrate the mail armor and the thick arming garments underneath. The thickness and the taper is appropriate for this type overall, just not necessarily this particular surviving example. The hexagonal cross-section is another point of contention on this model. It is iconic to the Oakeshott Type XVII longswords, which differ from other longsword types that came before them and after them that have diamond cross-sections. As you can see here, with a comparison to the Type 15A, 16A, and Type 18B longswords, the Type 17 should have a hexagonal cross-section with a flat central facet of varying lengths. Some terminate almost near the tip, some end in the bottom half of the blade. This example happens to be the latter. The central facet on the original quickly narrows down once it passes the ricasso. The sword I've got here doesn't do that, as the central facets remain wide and prominent, only quickly narrowing down near the termination. This leads to a different cross-section than the original, and introduces a lot more mass to the midsection of the blade, compounded by the convex distal taper that leads to a high thickness in this portion of the blade. These inconsistencies may cause a somewhat different mass distribution overall, but they don't result in a bad sword. In fact, it is still a pleasantly nimble sword that is somewhat easy to accelerate, but retains a good amount of tip control, easy to stop and redirect, which is highly crucial in longsword fencing. To ascertain the accuracy of his replica's mass distribution, I consulted Sterling Armory owner Chris Fields, who have been making swords for a 1/4 of a century now, and won CombatCon open cutting competition this year with a sword he made for himself. Chris also happens to be a space engineer, so this is someone who understands engineering and manufacturing, as well as sword usage. He studied many antique examples, including the Royal Armoury IX.16. He compared his measurements and findings with Matt Easton's results, and found some differences. Nevertheless, he told me that the sword retains its thickness along the ricasso and flares up once it transitions into a flattened hexagonal cross-section. Across the entire blade, it's thick and only has a minor distal taper. He also found its handling not exactly lovely, which contradicts Easton's finding somewhat, but this is still interesting and valuable information. His feelings about this original is that it is thick and hefty, ideal for armored combat with half-swording. Note that Chris is in the school of thought that makes lively swords that perform well in modern competitive settings. So his perspective could be coming from a different place than Matt Easton's. However, I think it isn't controversial to conclude that the Windlass replica is actually both lighter and livelier than the original, which is great if you want a generic Type 17 sword, only inspired by originals, like the Albion Sempach. It could be somewhat problematic if you want a very accurate replica. I compare its handling to a few longswords like the Albion Ringneck, Albion Regent, and the Angus Trim Type 16A.4, and found it perfectly balanced between cut and thrust in terms of handling. It's less authoritative than the Regent, a Type 18B that came after it in history, and the Atrium Type 16A.4, which came about a century earlier, but the point feels much nimbler. Not to the degree of Type 15A, which was popular in the late 14th century, about a quarter century older. Those have exceedingly tapered blade to an acute tip for plate armor fighting, but sacrifice a lot of cutting authority. Here you can see the comparison of the Type 17 to the Type 15A, how much different the geometries on the upper portion of the blades are. And if we look at the Wakefield English Hanger, this might become a pattern of swords handling well and fitting designs that are indeed representative to the original, but of manufacturing tolerance that's perhaps way too high to be close enough replicas of the originals. It would seem that Windlass has bitten off more than they can chew. If we come back to the fit and finish of the Type 17 longsword, we see the edges of the hexagonal cross-section are so gratuitously wavy and asymmetric, and the blade surfaces have a crazy amount of rippling. Now, I'm not mad, as these are not high-end swords, even though they are priced rather high and are marketed by the British National Museum of Arms and Armour as certified 1-to-1 replicas. We do have to take the prices into consideration. The other reason commonly presented as an excuse for the asymmetry and the rippling on the blade is its handmade nature. These blades do seem to be hand-forged, and the fitting may be handmade instead of cast. You have to admit that medieval originals tend to have a lot of minor asymmetries as well. But if you consider the modern reproductions, lots of even budget to mid-range offerings from makers like Hanway and LK Chen do it a lot better, despite that their swords are also hand-forged. And the symmetry and the flat surfaces are often a product of skilled grinding and polishing. Aside from modern makers, lots of hand-forged antique swords also have very flat surfaces without much rippling due to high-quality polishing. Look, I'm not trying to be pedantic or nitpicking, just trying to point out there's room for improvement. If you look at the termination of the hexagonal cross-section, it's clearly a problem. All aesthetic flaws aside, the asymmetries and the discrepancy of the transition from the hexagonal cross-section to the diamond one leads to a different mass distribution. As it is now, it needs a lot of work to be precise replications. The crossguard is a straight one with a simple square cross-section. Some minor tapers seem to be detected. It's not bad, but the edges and corners are not rounded, and these could be potential hot spots during handling. The opening of the guard is more or less tailored to the blade, although there's still some noticeable gaps. It's still much better than the huge gaping holes found on the usual windlass swords. Square cross-section isn't perfectly aligned with the blade or the grip when viewed laterally. The sense of a pommel is an octagonal one. The edges and corners do seem to be rounded off here. A nice touch by Matt Easton is having designed an octagonal grip to be flush with the 8 facets of the pommel. I've seen other owners of this sword claiming the edges of the 8 facets are not perfectly aligned, but on mine they do seem to align. The part of the pommel where it meets the grip has a lot of tool marking, indicating that it has been reworked a lot to fit the size of the grip. The transition is pretty good without any noticeable ledge. The pommel is nicely pinned, and the pin has been grounded mostly flush with the pommel. Did a great job here. The original pommel seems a little rounded overall, and this production pommel seems somewhat blocky if you compare it side by side to the one on the Albion ring neck to see how much more rounded it is. Still, it's not uncomfortable to handle. The pommel overall has a ton of asymmetries. Everywhere you look, you see crooked edges. I wish they had spent a little more time and attention, but so far, this hasn't caused any discomfort during handling. The grip has that octagonal cross-section, which is a nice artistic license by Matt Easton, as the original grip has rotten away. It has a good tapering and the sides are flat, so indexing the edge alignment is easy. It has much better risers and core impressions on the leather wrapping to be above and beyond the typical Windlass offerings. However, the risers are a little bit too prominent to the point that sometimes they could be hot spots during handling. The seam of the leather wrapping is not stitched, but compressed and glued like the high-end productions. However, unlike the grips on Albion or Atrium swords, where the leather is wrapped in one direction and then counter-wrapped in the other direction, so there's no gap at the seam. The seams on both of these Royal Armouries Collection swords stick out prominently. On top of the risers, they are quite uncomfortable, and quite frankly, they hurt to handle unless you wear gloves. Each sword comes with a handsome real scabbard with wooden core and leather wrapping on top. The shaping and dimensions are period correct, and they retain the sword nicely, if a little too tight. This one comes with a handsome bronze shape, well designed with a spade or foliate perforation and decorative filework. This is a vast upgrade from Windlass' usual floppy leather sheaths. Now we turn our attention to the Wakefield Hanger, which is a unique type of late medieval single-edged swords. Both the hill furniture and the blade types are distinct from the period falchions and messers, and this type of sword tends to be exceedingly lightweight for their sizes. I think Windlass has done a great job capturing the unique profile and the hollow ground edge bevel from the fuller to the edge. It only transitions to a full flat grind once the fuller terminates. The long false edge is prominent, just like on the original example. However, like the true edge, it's not sharpened, only terminates to a very fine butter knife edge, which should be relatively easy to sharpen by the user. Two potential discrepancies with the original are present. One, the fuller appears to be a lot narrower. You can see on the original, the width of the fuller is close to a third of the entire blade's width, whereas the Windlass version has a fuller that's about 1/5 of the blade's width. The grinding at the transition from the fuller to the false edge is quite confused, and the line is suddenly crooked. How does having a narrow fuller end up reducing the weight? And this one I've got is potentially 2 ounces lighter than the original? I have no idea. Maybe the hollow ground geometry is more pronounced than the original? It's hard to tell. What I can tell is the base thickness is once again thinner than the specifications, 6.3 millimeters. It starts out at 5.9 and slowly tapers 10% to 5.3 at midpoint, from which point the thickness tapers down rapidly. The 10-inch long section with the false edge is almost all under 3 millimeters. This bottom half appears to be slightly thinner than the original, which might explain the missing weight. For a blade with a 27-inch long cutting edge, it's quite light and nimble. The point is precise, the blade is easy to accelerate when you swing it, but can carry a good amount of authority. The convex distal taper on both swords introduced more mass to the middle third of the blades, potentially making the mass distribution a bit funny, but not handling in a bad way. The benefit is introducing more rigidity to the middle of the blade, so both blades seem pretty stiff in the bottom 2/3 and only flex near the tips. The Wakefield Hanger's blade has a nice ringtone when you knock on it, a sign of consistent heat treatment and sound hilt construction. A lot of effort has been poured into the accuracy of the hilt fittings too. They seem to have the correct dimensions and tapering. The unique pommel with a beak looks like some Germanic messers, and it forms almost a D-guard with a knuckle bow, which is one of the first to appear in European history. It's not completely enclosed though. There's a small gap between them. The pommel has chamfered edges just like the original. However, the edges at the bottom don't seem to be rounded, and it could cause some discomfort during handling as the entire hilt is incredibly short. As you can see here, part of my palm is sticking out when gripping this sword. The geometry of the grip and the pommel are designed to be comfortable to hold down to in saber grip, but the edges at the bottom of the pommel can create some hot spots. The peening of the pommel is done well and is also filed flush, so good job there. The grip has an oblong cross-section which fits the shape of the pommel well. The sides are flat for easy indexing of the edge alignment. 5 prominent risers and cord impressions are there to create tractions for your hand. It's great in concept, but the implementation here left something to be desired. The risers are a bit too prominent, and the shaping of them make the whole grip a bit uncomfortable. As I talked about earlier, the seam of the leather wrapping is sticking out, especially on top of those risers, making the grip painful to handle. The knuckle bow is also not perfectly aligned with the grip of the blade. It's canted slightly to one side. James Elmsley, who is a British expert in medieval single-edged swords, said the original was also like that, so perhaps this isn't a big problem. The lug on the guard, unlike the nagel on German messers, isn't a separate piece, but it's a one piece along with the rest of the guard. They didn't use the first prototype's design of having a side bar on the outside of your hand, as the original piece only has a stub that's broken at the end. So they will go safer to include what's left on the original. I have no problem with that, but the edges on this lug are once again not rounded or chamfered. Some more potential hot spots. It has to be said that the entire grip is short to stay faithful to the original. Matt Easton concluded that the sword was not meant for someone with plate gauntlets, which wouldn't fit onto the grip at all. Considering how much more protective the guard is, it's probably made as a light and easy to carry sidearm for foot soldiers handling large primary weapons, maybe a billman or a longbowman. So one of these guys, instead of those fellas in footplate harnesses. The scabbard for the Wakefield Hanger is also well made. The ring flap on one side has an opening for the lug on the guard on this one, so nice touch. The bronze shape is simpler than the one on the longsword scabbard, but it's still nice looking and period correct. Overall, each part of the sword is quite well designed as one would expect from Matt Easton, but I think Windlass implementation has room for improvement. If you want an excellent reproduction sword that handles well and looks just like the original, for not a truckload of money, these are a sure bet. If you are looking for one-to-one replicas, however, they need to work to get there. Magnificent efforts by the designer. The maker, however, should do better. It's also noteworthy that these swords tend to have a large variety in terms of weight. I have friends reporting their swords on the same model vary by 4 to 5 ounces. Brother Nathaniel was going to send his English two-handed sword in the Royal Armouries Collection to me for a review, but when he sent the sword to Swordfan Massive Cross for sharpening, a crack was discovered on the blade. They're contacting museum replicas for a replacement. Look, it's not my sword, but since I was going to review this exact one, this is too close to home. Incidentally, another sword in the Royal Armouries Collection sharpened by Massive Cross was also returned, as the grip is misaligned with the blade. In total, that's 2 for 3. Clearly, their quality control should try harder. I genuinely hope they iron out the problems in the first batch and improve the quality and faithfulness to the originals, and potentially work on some more future models. I will sharpen both of these swords and do a test cutting for the second part of this review, which will hopefully be released in a week or two, so stay tuned.